In the warm cradle of the Iranian plateau, where the Zagros Mountains descend gently into the low plains, there lies a land older than memory. Long before the names of kings echoed in stone, before cities rose or temples crowned the earth, this was a place of rivers and soil, of silence and sun. Here, where the Karen River wound its slow path toward the sea, the people of early Susiana found a world that offered both shelter and sustenance. The river was not merely water, it was life, a moving thread between past and future, between the mountain ranges and the southern marshes. Along its banks, reeds swayed and crops found root. In this land, where present-day Khuzestan now lies, the story of Elam would one day unfold. The earth here was fertile, warmed by the sun, fed by the silt that traveled down from the hills. Before writing, before walls, men and women gathered clay and grain, shaped vessels, tended flocks, and learned the rhythms of the land. They did not yet call themselves Elamites, no names had yet settled on their tongues, but they were its forebears. Theirs was a quiet life, etched not in words but in the patterns of settlement, in pottery, in the slow domestication of both plant and beast. Archaeologists call these earliest communities the people of the Proto-Elamite world. But to those who lived then, there were no such titles, only the seasons, the harvests, and the stars. Their main center was Susa, a place that would rise again and again through the ages like a great heartbeat. In these earliest times, around 4,000 years before the Common Era, Susa began as a gathering of homes atop a gentle rise. Its people built with mud brick, shaped with care, and aligned their lives with the cycles of nature. The settlement would soon become more than just a village. It would become a sanctuary of order in a world still wild. To the west lay Mesopotamia, a land of similar promise. And though it was in Uruk that the first great cities and written records would emerge, Susa was not far behind. It watched. It listened. And soon it began to write its own history, in clay, in labor, in stone. But that part of the tale still waits its telling. For now, in this first breath of Elamite time, we see only the soft beginnings, the hint of something greater stirring in the soil. A people finding their rhythm. A land preparing to speak. And though we do not yet hear the full voice of Elam, its breath is already in the wind, its heart already beating beneath the earth. In the hush before recorded history, the land of Elam stirred more distinctly. Mud brick walls rose higher along the gentle elevation of Susa. Between 3200 and 2700 BCE, in that tender threshold between survival and civilization, the Proto-Elamite world found its voice. Here, at last, lived people whose hands shaped symbols. Not yet full writing, but the seed of thought pressed into clay, simple pictographs, tokens of trade, ideas of ownership and ceremony. In the earliest tablets, one can nearly hear the careful fingerprints of an artisan, the faint stroke of a reed stylus forming shapes that meant something, grain, livestock, perhaps offerings to the unseen powers of earth and sky. Susa was no longer simply homes in the landscape. It stood as a focal node of human energy, where craftspeople and traders met at the river's edge. The Karen, still flowing steadily, bore goods from far and near. Clay vessels, adorned with geometric patterns, water buffalo figurines, early seals, they all carried messages of life, of relationships, of careful order. It was during this time that villages became towns, and towns began to dream of history. Proto-Elamite script remains a mystery to modern eyes, but that is because its creators wanted permanence, not performance. On clay, they marked the quantities of grain, they marked the distribution of goods, they etched the names of merchants and the measure of offerings. In doing so, they began to anchor their lives to time, to agreements, to enduring memory. Yet the architecture of Susa remained simple, a core of dwellings clustered around open courtyards and narrow streets. But within these courtyards, life unfolded. Potters shaped pots, mothers ground grain, priests, if one could call them so, placed offerings at low altars of baked earth. The boundary between the sacred and the mundane was light. There were no grand temples yet, only a sacred impulse carried in stone and clay. But behind that impulse lay curiosity of neighbors, of travelers, of distant lands. To the west, Mesopotamian cities already bristled with ziggurats and scribes. Whether through trade or wandering merchants, ideas and forms began to reach Susa. Sometimes in the design of a seal, sometimes in the shape of a pot, sometimes in the rhythm of a word. And so, even now, as the symbols lie silent to us, the breath of intent remains. The people of Proto-Elam, unknown, unnamed, were alive to their acts of ordering the world. They laid foundations not in mortar, but in mind-stirring creation. Their legacy would echo in clay for centuries to come. Thus the second chapter of the Elamite story ends not with grand gestures, but with the quiet, confident tick of human impulse, to count, to name, to remember. In the deep hush following the stirrings of clay tablet and settlement, a clearer form of order began to emerge. The land that revered the slow flow of the Karen now felt the stirring of leadership and lineage. As the centuries unfolded, the gentle heartbeat of villages thickened into the pulse of a nascent state. Around the dawn of the 3rd millennium BCE, specifically between roughly 2700 and 2400 BCE, the Proto-Elamite age yielded to what scholars now call the Old Elamite era, the time when the first dynasties took shape in the land of Elam. The Awan dynasty, among the earliest of these, found its seat in Susa, yet its rule spread across the Susiana plain and rose into the highlands. Though the names and stories are faint, whispers of kings and their reign survive through inscriptions, carried in neighboring tongues or preserved in later retellings. One such ruler, En-Mibarj of Kish, is said, in Sumerian tradition, to have subdued the land of Elam, hinting at both its growing presence and its entanglement with the affairs of distant Mesopotamia. It was an initial acknowledgement of Elam, a gesture from beyond its borders that Elam existed, and that it mattered. In time, the dynastic tapestry would grow richer, branching into the Simashki and later the Sukalma lines, but for now, the land bore the first silken strands of regal identity. These early dynasties ruled across a patchwork of communities, from the river's embrace in the lowlands to reaches in the Zagros foothills. They drew upon the ancient systems of accounting and record, with tablets set with symbols of grain and livestock, continuing the tradition of order embedded in clay and labor. Yet, their rule was not brilliant or triumphant in the way of legend. For now, it was tentative, emergent, a careful weaving of governance from the threads of terrain and tradition. They shaped alliances, mediated ancient rivalries, and began to anchor the idea of Elam more clearly within the wisdom of history. The old craftsmen who once stamped their tokens in clay, and the elders who guided their people by river and hearth, now found their world pushed forward by those who would call themselves kings. The land adapted, shaped by both memory and purpose. The whispers of authority grew, adding cadence to the still silence of its beginnings. And so, just as the land had once birthed its people, those people now birthed their order. The quiet dwellings gave way to courtyards of ruling presence, and the symbols of earlier scribes began to carry not only grain and labor, but the weight of lineage and legacy. In the waning light of this chapter, Elam stands poised between the age of symbols and the age of sovereignty, its first voices of rulership preparing the land for tales yet to be told. Time, like the rivers that watered Elam, never flows in a single line. It twists and pools, surges and recedes. And so too did the early states of Elam gather themselves, not as a singular empire, but as a constellation of powers, each turning slowly in the orbit of the land's ancient soul. From the cradle of Susa, and from the uplands of Anshan and beyond, new dynasties began to take shape. The Awan dynasty, earliest among them, rose in the shadows of the Zagros foothills. Though its home remains uncertain, perhaps nestled in valleys now long silent, its presence in history is clear. For the first time, Elamite kings were named. Their reigns were counted. Their power, though fragile, was felt. The kings of Awan did not rule alone. They stood alongside the mighty of Mesopotamia, sometimes allies, sometimes rivals. One of them, Puzur-in-Shushenaq, would briefly lift Elam to heights it had never known. From the city of Susa, he cast off the authority of the Akkadian kings and declared himself sovereign. In stone, he left inscriptions in both Akkadian and a new, local script, what modern scholars call linear Elamite. His ambition was not just to rule, but to root Elam's identity in its own tongue, its own signs, its own spirit. But such moments of clarity are rare in early history. After Puzur-in-Shushenaq, the Awan line faded. The highlands stirred again, and the people of Semashki came to the fore. They were mountain rulers, their power flowing not from temples but from strength, military and marital. The Semashki kings forged bonds through marriage with Mesopotamian houses and led armies across the Tigris. In time, they would march on Ur, the great Sumerian city, and bring down its last ruler. For a brief breath, Elam stood taller than its ancient neighbor. Yet the Semashki did not centralize their world. Elam, even in strength, was a land of many centers. This nature, both its challenge and its charm, would take form in the dynasty that followed, the Sukalma. Unlike the solitary kings of Mesopotamia, the Elamite Sukalmas ruled as a family, brothers and sons holding titles across both the lowlands and the mountains. They shared power, delegated rule, and preserved harmony in a landscape too vast, too wild, to be held by one hand alone. Through these early dynasties, Elam became more than a region. It became a political culture, one that accepted plurality, that embraced diversity of language, of land, of leadership. It grew not by conquest, but by connection. So the land endured, not through empire, but through pattern, a pattern of resilience, woven through valleys, remembered in stone, whispered in the wind. And through it all, the people of Elam, potters, scribes, herders, priests, lived their lives in quiet rhythm, beneath the eyes of kings whose names are now faint, but not forgotten. The people of Elam were not alone. Though they lived amid rivers and foothills, far from the towering temples of Mesopotamia or the teeming streets of distant cities, they were always part of something larger, a web of exchange as old as time. Long before coins, before borders, before merchants wrote contracts on wax and papyrus, there were paths. Some worn by feet, some traced by river currents, others only imagined, but all bearing gifts, ideas, and the quiet movement of lives. Susa, the heart of early Elam, stood not only as a place of kings and scribes but as a threshold between worlds. From the west came obsidian, copper, and luxury goods carved with the marks of Sumer and Akkad. From the east, over the Zagros and beyond, came carnelian and lapis, stones from the Indus Valley, shaped by hands that never saw the sun over Susa. Their presence in Elamite soil was no accident. It was proof of trade, of movement, of silent connection. These were not mere exchanges of goods. They were exchanges of meaning. A seal carved in far-off Harappa might lie buried in Susa, carried across deserts by unseen hands. Pottery fragments found in Elamite sites bear traces of styles born far from its rivers. In return, Elam offered its own fine ceramics, wool, bitumen, perhaps even grain. And with each offering came echoes of Elamite life, the scent of its hearths, the rhythm of its rivers, the hands of its artisans. Unlike empires built on conquest, trade moved gently. It left behind no armies, only beads, seals, and sherds of memory. It moved through trust, through repetition, through the slow-growing ties of need and knowledge. And in this quiet economy, Elam thrived. The mountains did not isolate. The rivers did not confine. Instead, they guided, making Elam a bridge between the worlds of Sumer and the rising lands of the east. Here, amid the hills and plains, was not a dead end, but a passage, one lined with dust and laughter, with exchange and encounter. In the stillness of ancient storehouses and the sealed tombs of kings, these goods still whisper of a time when distant worlds touched through trade. A time when Elam, in its calm dignity, stood not apart from the world, but as one of its enduring crossroads. It began with a name. Not a new city, nor a conquest, nor a god, but a title. King of Anshan and Susa. With these words, a vision took shape. Two lands, long apart, now spoken together. One lay cradled in the Zagros highlands, Anshan, ancient and strong, veiled by stone and sky. The other sat low upon the plain, Susa, old and wise, rooted beside the Karen's gentle flow. In uniting them, the Elamites did not build something new. They recalled something deeper, the soul of their land, whole again. This was the beginning of Elam's golden age. It rose softly, around the 15th century before our era, and it did not shout. Instead, it built. Slowly, brick upon brick, shrine beside palace. It was an age of temples and kings, of art that whispered of faith, and of rule that knew its strength. The rulers of this age, the Kshatrikids, sought not just to govern but to shape the world in the image of their gods. One of them, Untashnaparisha, left behind a vision in earth and stone. Near Susa, he raised a sacred city Auduuntash, now known as Chogazanbil. Within its concentric walls stood temples, gates, and at its heart, a great ziggurat. It was not made for war, nor for rule, but for worship. This place, touched by wind and prayer, became the high altar of Elamite devotion. Its bricks still bear his name, gently pressed into clay as if to ask the earth itself to remember. In this time, Elamite writing bloomed with new confidence. Though the Akkadian tongue still echoed in diplomacy and stone, the native Elamite script stood firm, gracing the walls of sanctuaries and the sides of votive statues. Kings now spoke in their own words. They praised their gods in Shushanak, Naparisha, Keririsha, not through conquest alone, but through offering and art. Susa, ever the pulse of the lowlands, blossomed into a center of splendor. It held the treasures of Mesopotamia, brought back not by trade but by triumph. Stelaean statues, once belonging to Babylonian lords, now stood beneath Elamite skies, a silent testimony to the might of kings like Shatruk Nakanti and Shilhak in Shushanak. Yet even in triumph, their rule bore dignity. It sought not destruction, but continuity, Elam standing firm among the shifting empires around it. This was not an empire of iron and fire. It was a civilization of faith, beauty, and balance. Anshan gave it strength, Susa gave it grace. Together, they formed a rhythm, a harmony between mountain and plain, temple and court, king and god. And so, Elam flourished, not loudly, but lastingly. In the open basin near the river Des, where the wind bends low grass and the stars once hung in silent clusters above the plain, there rose a city not meant for commerce or kingship, but for the divine. Its name was Dur-Untash, the city of Untash, though it would come to be known by the hill of bricks that marked its core, Chogazanbil. Here, stone spoke softly, and the silence of the desert was filled not with the clamor of soldiers, but with hymns, incense, and the long shadows of priests passing beneath moonlight. The city was born from devotion, founded in the 13th century before the Common Era by Untashnaparisha, a ruler who understood that the gods did not dwell only in heaven, but also in the works of men. He envisioned a city wholly consecrated to the sacred, ringed by walls, pierced by gates, crowned by the great ziggurat at its heart. Unlike the royal complexes of Susa, Chogazanbil bore no royal palace. There were no courts, no councils, no markets. Instead, there were temples, dozens of them, each dedicated to a god or goddess of the Elamite pantheon. Naparisha, the great deity of Anshan. In Shushanak, the protector of Susa. Kiririsha, the mother goddess. Their names were pressed into bricks, again and again, in quiet reverence. The ziggurat itself, 5 levels high, reached toward the heavens like a mountain carved by human hands. At its summit, now lost to time, may have stood a shrine, a place where only the highest priests and perhaps the king himself might have entered, carrying offerings in silence. At night, the great structure must have glowed softly in the moonlight, its shadow stretching far across the earth. Art flourished in this sacred air. Even bricks bore beauty, some glazed, some painted, some carved with geometric lines or the names of the divine. Doors of bronze and wood once stood between columned halls. Statues, now broken and silent, once held votive bowls or watched from alcoves with calm, eternal gaze. But it was not merely art for beauty's sake. Every line, every form, served a purpose, to bridge the human and the divine. The very layout of the city, with its sacred axis and its enclosing walls, echoed a vision of cosmic harmony, order from chaos, sanctity from dust. In Choga's anvil, the Elamites poured their soul into stone. Here, they did not rule, they remembered. They listened. They reached toward the eternal. And though the city would one day fall, its temples abandoned, its bricks scattered, the spirit it carried did not vanish. It remained, like a breath in the dust, waiting to be heard again. She sits still, as she has for over 3,000 years. Her arms rest gently on her lap, her posture noble, her body cast not in clay or stone, but in bronze, heavy, enduring, unyielding. She does not speak, yet her silence is profound. This is Queen Naparesu, consort of King Untashnaparisha. She lived in the age of temples and ziggurats, in the very heart of Elam's golden time. But while kings left behind inscriptions and monuments, it is through this statue that she has reached us, a woman of rank, of presence, and of quiet command. Her statue, discovered centuries later in the ruins of Susa, weighs over 1,000 kilograms. Hollow above, but solid below, it was made to endure, never to be moved. Upon it is written a curse, a stern warning in cuneiform, invoking the gods to strike down anyone who dares to defile her likeness. It was more than art. It was invocation. Permanence. A demand to be remembered. She is dressed in the fashion of the court, hands crossed, wrists adorned, her garments flowing with the lines of dignity and restraint. And though her face has not survived, the form of her body still holds grace. There is nothing of aggression in her posture, only strength. From this one statue, we see a fuller vision of Elamite life. A world where queens were not hidden or silent. Where they could command bronze, invoke the divine, and anchor themselves within the sacred city. Naparesu was not merely wife to a king. She was a sovereign figure in her own right, one whose likeness merited protection, whose memory demanded reverence. In the religious life of Elam, women held roles not just as mothers or priestesses, but as figures of lineage and legitimacy. Goddesses such as Kiririsha, considered a mother of gods, were revered in stone and offering alike. Queens stood beside kings not as ornaments, but as partners, carriers of divine favor and dynastic strength. And so Naparesu remains. Long after the walls of Susa have fallen, long after the ziggurat's last shadow stretched across the plain, she endures in metal. Still, solemn, watching. Not forgotten. Not silent. She sits still. Not in a throne of gold, nor beside her king in a court of men, but alone, heavy, enduring, carved in bronze. Her arms rest softly on her lap, her garments flowing in lines both regal and restrained. She speaks no words, yet every curve of her figure is a declaration. This is Naparesu, Queen of Elam, consort to Untashnaparisha, and the only Elamite woman whose presence has survived not in whisper, but in weight. The statue that bears her name is no ordinary likeness. Cast in the 14th century before the Common Era, it weighs more than 1,000 kilograms. The lower half is solid, meant never to be moved. It was made not to travel, not to triumph, but to remain. To last. To be seen. Its purpose was sacred, a votive offering, placed within a temple in Susa, dedicated to the gods of the land. On her skirt, faint but defiant, is an inscription. It is not a poem, nor a prayer, but a curse. She calls upon the gods of Elam to strike down any who dare to damage her image or erase her name. It is a voice of warning, strong, precise, final. She does not raise her hand. She does not wield a weapon. Her power lies in presence. And in that presence, something profound is revealed, that Elamite queens were not mere symbols, nor silent figures in the background. They stood within the sacred. They acted in their own right. They bore the authority of lineage, of devotion, of permanence. Her statue tells us more than scrolls ever could. In the lines of her arms, the fold of her dress, the set of her shoulders, we see a woman who knew her place, not beneath, but beside. Her ringed fingers suggest a marriage of strength, her rigid frame a body given to the gods. She becomes more than a queen. She becomes a bridge between ruler and temple, between mortal and divine. She has no face now. Time has taken it. And yet, in her stillness, she remains whole. Even now, in the silence of museums and under the distant light of foreign lands, Naparesu waits. Her voice, though sealed in bronze, endures. Her curse protects her. Her presence speaks. She is Elam, not in conquest, but in continuity. The age of temples did not last untouched. Even in the golden quiet of Elam's middle years, the world beyond stirred, and in the distance, to the west, Babylon grew bold again. Its cities, thick with writing and worship, stood not in isolation but in hunger. It reached eastward, toward the Zagros, toward Susa, toward the treasures whispered to lie in the lands of Elam. But Elam, too, was watching. It did not wait behind its walls. By the 12th century before our era, Elamite kings no longer contented themselves with prayers alone. Under Shutruk Nakanti, the temple builders became warriors. Their gods did not only bless, they marched. From Susa, Elamite armies crossed the Tigris and entered Babylonian lands. They took cities, overran temples, and captured royal tablets that bore the pride of kings. The stele of Hammurabi, that great pillar of law, was carried away. Sacred objects were seized not in desecration, but in claim. To take was to rule. To possess was to inherit. Babylon, weakened by its own strife, could not withstand the Elamite force. Its gods, once dominant, were humbled. For a time, Babylon bowed its head. But conquest in Elam was never only conquest. It was a form of reverence, fierce, but shaped by belief. The Elamites did not destroy the sacred. They preserved it. What they carried away, they enshrined. What they conquered, they kept with care. Statues of foreign gods stood in Elamite temples. Foreign laws were stored, not shattered. The victors did not erase, they absorbed. This war between Elam and Babylon was not the first, nor would it be the last. It was a tide, recurring through the centuries, of rivalry and imitation, of conflict and reflection. For Elam and Babylon, like twin stars, moved in orbits that often crossed, each influencing the other's form. But for a moment, rare, resounding, it was Elam that stood tall. The temple still burned with incense. The ziggurats still climbed toward the heavens. And now, within their shadow, rested the treasures of Babylon, not looted in rage, but held in triumph, reminders of a power that Elam did not merely dream of, but had finally reached. The sun does not fall all at once. First, it lingers, long and golden, across the stone. And in that final glow, it reveals things otherwise unseen. So it was with the reign of Shilhak-in-Shushanak. He came to the throne of Elam not in chaos, but in calm succession, as brother to a king, husband to a queen, son of a line that had given Elam its might. His rule stretched nearly 30 years, a rare length in such ancient days. And in that time, the land flourished once more. Under Shilhak, Elam reached wide. Campaigns pushed north and west, into lands that had once pressed against Elamite borders. Cities were taken, borders shifted. And yet, it was not only the sword that marked his reign, but the chisel and brick. He adorned Susa with inscriptions bearing his name, not in haste, but in permanence. The great temple still stood. The ziggurat of Choga Zambil still crowned the plain. And now, the city's sacred spaces bore witness to his deeds, etched in carefully carved lines, repeated with the rhythm of praise. He was not the builder of a new Elam, but the guardian of its peak, the keeper of all that had come before. In his inscriptions, he named his victories. In his dedications, he honored the gods. He understood the weight of legacy. But even as the walls held firm and the sun gleamed on painted bricks, the winds began to shift. Beyond Elam, old enemies stirred. Babylon, long humbled, began to rise again. Assyria watched from the north. And within Elam itself, the unity of highland and lowland, so carefully held, began to loosen. The temples still stood, but fewer offerings came. The kings still ruled, but their reach grew thinner. Shilhak-in-Shushanak died, and with him passed the last full breath of Elamite splendor. He left behind no ruin, no fire, no fall. Only a quiet fading, a golden hue that gave way, slowly, to dusk. And yet his memory endures. In every inscription where his name is repeated, in every brick where the gods are called, his voice lingers. He is the last great light before the shadow, the flame that, though dimmed, still flickers in the silence of old Susa. When a kingdom fades, it is seldom with the crash of ruins. It recedes quietly, like a tide pulling back from the shore, revealing the cracks that lay just beneath. After the luminous reign of Shilhak-in-Shushanak, Elam entered a time known to scholars as the Neo-Elamite period. The unity of Anshan and Susa, once held fast by dynastic kinship and shared faith, began to falter. Centers of power rose and fell, alliances frayed like ancient rope. In the foothills and across the plains, minor kingdoms emerged, Elamites of different houses claiming rule over fragments of the once mighty land. Names flickered quickly across the clay: kings of Susa, lords of the highlands, regents of Susiana. No single voice spoke for them all. To the west, Babylon regained strength. To the north, Assyria grew in both ambition and armament. Elam, diminished, faced the grinding pressure of its neighbors. Raids became more common. Once, sacred cities were captured, temples desecrated or plundered. Yet Elam did not vanish. It reconfigured. Power shifted to inland cities, perhaps to Anshan or to the Zagros foothills. Keeping Elam together became less about ruling territories and more about preserving traditions, language, cults, and the memory of kings who once declared themselves king of Anshan and Susa. Still, the land bore quiet courage. Priests retained rituals. Local governors continued to invoke Inshushinak and Naparisha in their ceremonies. Communities held fast, not with armies, but with faith. But years passed, and those once mighty names faded into repetition, dynasties of uncertain succession, each striving to assert authority while holding on to fragments of an older pride, the ziggurat's shadow, the promise of unity, the memory of golden days. And through it all, Elam endured, not in the way of empires, but in the echoes of its people, in the quiet resilience of its highlands and its plains. Thus ends the chapter of struggle, not with triumph, nor with defeat, but with lasting defiance, a civilization that, even in the act of fading, remembered who it had been. Time bends toward an ending not with a shout, but with a hush. So it was for Elam, and especially for Susa, once its heart, now enduring a dark hour beneath foreign wrath. The north had stirred again. Assyria, that mighty neighbor, pressed forward under the stern command of Ashurbanipal, ruler known for both intellect and unbending power. His ambition stretched his reach, and Susa, in its quiet dignity, lay in his path. In the mid-78th century BCE, under a sky heavy with dread, the Assyrian armies descended. Elam did not meet war with the fervor of the Kshatrikids, nor with the zeal of temple hymns. It met it with twilight resolve. The toll of centuries echoed in every crumbled wall. Susa fell, not through sudden collapse, but by steady pressure. Its gates were pried open or set ablaze. Within its sacred courtyards, priests fled or perished, offerings were sacked or scattered. Statues cracked. Bricks crumbled. The great ziggurat's shadow seemed to shrink before the roaring of engines of war. Yet, even beneath Ashurbanipal's wrath, Elam did not vanish. Its people were scattered, but not extinguished. Survivors carried their customs into exile. In neighboring realms, Persia, Media, Babylon, Elamite priests spoke their liturgies. Elamite scribes wrote agreements. Elamite names appeared in court records and military rolls, a soft persistence like the memory of incense in abandoned halls. It was not the end of Elam, but a new chapter of resilience. The city of Susa lay broken, but the faith in Inshushinak lived on in whisper. The legacy of kings continued in lineage, if not in dynasty. The land endured in the voices of those who carried its memory beyond its borders. The Assyrian blow may have fractured Elam's body, but not its soul. In the dust of ruins, quiet lives continued. The stones cooled. The winds blew across shattered bricks. The waters of the Karen still flowed. And even as the empire of Elam receded into history, it endured, not as a realm, but as echo. Elam did not return. Its ziggurats no longer rose, its kings no longer carved their names into bricks, and the unity of Anshan and Susa was no more. But its story was not over. In silence, it continued, carried not by thrones, but by memory. In the wake of Susa's fall, two new powers rose from the earth, the Medes, from the northern Zagros, and the Persians, from the plains of Fars. Both would leave deep marks on the world. But beneath their crowns, buried in their speech and in their customs, lay the soft inheritance of Elam. The Elamite language, once etched into clay in sacred halls, lived on, not in pride, but in service. When the Achaemenid kings came to rule, they issued inscriptions in three tongues: Old Persian, Babylonian, and Elamite. Among them, Elamite remained, the language of scribes, of law, of ceremony. It no longer led, but it endured. Susa, though scarred, was not abandoned. It became once again a city of kings, this time Persian ones. The great palace of Darius I, father of the empire, rose upon Susa's old bones. Its halls, grand and ordered, were built with the help of Elamite artisans, Elamite labor, and Elamite knowledge. And in its foundations, fragments of earlier temples remained, the sacred stones of Inshushinak repurposed, but not forgotten. In religion, too, traces of Elam held fast. Though the gods of Persia bore new names, some bore the old spirit. Mountain deities, mother goddesses, and divine guardians of the underworld, echoes of Naparisha, Kiririsha, and Inshushinak, stirred quietly behind newer altars. Even the name Anshan, once half the title of Elam's kings, passed into Persian royal lineage. Cyrus the Great, the founder of the Achaemenid Empire, first called himself King of Anshan. He stood on ground once ruled by Elamite blood. Thus Elam, though lost in the telling, remained in the fabric of things. Like a thread woven into a newer cloth, it no longer called attention to itself, but held the pattern together. What is forgotten by name is not always lost. In the palaces of Persia, in the script of imperial edicts, in the rituals of temple and tomb, Elam breathed on. Words, like rivers, can be dammed, but often they find new paths, flowing onward in quieter streams. Long after Elam's stone walls were toppled and its temples silent, its language refused to vanish. Elamite took its place within the grand tapestry of Near Eastern tongues, enduring not as a language of rule, but one of record, ritual, and resonance. When Cyrus the Great shaped his Achaemenid realm, he reached into Elam's legacy, embracing not only its lands, but its script. Royal inscriptions were cast not merely in the elegant curves of Old Persian, nor solely in the familiar lines of Babylonian, but in Elamite as well. To read them was to hear the echoes of a civilization long past, brought into the service of a new empire. In Susa, the city that wintered under Darius and Xerxes, scribes still inscribed Elamite. They wrote commands and accounts, temple protocols, and administrative edicts, in the script of a birthplace no longer sovereign, yet still sacred. Yet the word spoke a changed world. Elamite no longer stood among living tongues, it was preserved, like fine music recorded in an ancient book. It guided bureaucrats, offered structure to rituals, and woven into the palace halls, remained as a whispered memory of Elam's enduring dignity. The language endured longer than many expected. In the courts of Persia, under the rise of new dynasties and the rise of new gods, Elamite remained. It spoke not of conquest, but of continuity, an unspoken vow between past and present. And then, at last, it faded from use. Yet its lines endure in inscriptions, on bricks, in the margins of stone tablets. For those who learn its marks, it still speaks. In these quiet marks, traced by stylus and breath, Elam endures, no longer a realm, but a voice in the echo. Even as its language quieted and its gods were renamed, Elam never truly vanished. Its name, though no longer spoken in royal courts, settled softly into the hills and valleys it once ruled. Across the land once called Susiana, new voices rose, but they carried the old syllables still. In Khuzestan, in Elam province, and in the ruins of Susa, the memory lingered, not in monuments, but in the land itself. The cities remained. Some crumbled into hillocks of earth, some were built over by new empires. Yet beneath each layer, the stones of Elam still slept. Farmers plowed fields where scribes once sat a day. Shepherds passed the shadows of temples now flattened by time. And though few knew the names of Naparisha or Inshushinak, the soil did. Place remembers, even when people forget. The highlands that once bore the weight of Anshan still shimmer in dry summer light. The plains where Susa once stood still gather the spring rains. Rivers still carve the same paths they did when Elamite kings made offerings beside them. And now and then, a seal emerges from the ground. Or a statue fragment. Or a clay tablet, its cuneiform pressed with the calm patience of ancient scribes. Each one speaks softly, as if waiting for someone to listen. The name Elam would be taken by later chroniclers, by Greeks and Babylonians, by the Hebrew scribes of distant lands, and passed down in stories, some true, some confused, all tinted by time. They wrote of Elam as a kingdom of old, a land of mystery, a people once mighty. And in doing so, they kept its shadow alive. In truth, Elam did not die. It withdrew. It gave its knowledge to others. Its bricks became the foundations of new temples. Its gods were folded into new pantheons. Its people blended into the Persian wave that followed. But the land still bears its echo. And if one stands quietly among the ruins of Susa, in the still hour before dawn, when the light first touches the broken walls, it is not hard to imagine the murmur of prayers, the scent of incense, the slow step of a priestess passing through dust. Elam is gone. But the earth remembers. Long before the temples fell, long before kings carved their triumphs into stone, the people of Elam lifted their eyes not to conquest, but to the sacred. They believed, as many did in ancient lands, that the world was guided by powers greater than themselves. Yet the gods of Elam were not the same as those of Sumer or Akkad. They were quieter, older, drawn from the mountains and rivers, shaped by the rhythms of the earth. At the heart of their belief stood Inshushinak, the guardian of Susa, the protector of the city's gates, the god who watched over the dead and the judge of souls. His presence lingered not in fire or thunder, but in silence. Inshushinak was a god of boundaries, between life and death, between city and wilderness. His name appears in the oldest inscriptions, and he remained revered even as new empires rose. Beside him stood Naparisha, the great god, worshipped in the highlands of Anshan. He was a deity of cosmic order, of fertility and rain, of the sustaining breath that gave life to all things. In depictions, he is both majestic and obscure, never fully explained, but always present. His wife, Kiririsha, was called the Great Mother, protector of cities, and source of strength for women and kings alike. Together, they formed a divine pair, mirroring the unity Elam once sought between mountain and plain. Other gods walked the Elamite heavens: Humban, the god of royalty and justice; Ishmekarab, the enforcer of divine law; Pinakir, a celestial goddess linked to the stars and fate. These were not distant beings. They were close, inhabiting temples, statues, and sacred precincts. Offerings were made not in fear, but in familiarity. Elamite religion did not demand vast ziggurats, though they built them. It sought balance between the sacred and the ordinary, the celestial and the earthbound. Rituals were intimate. Prayers were practical. The divine was woven into the fabric of daily life. Even when foreign powers came, Akkadian, Babylonian, Assyrian, the Elamites did not forsake their gods. They adapted. They borrowed. But they held fast to their pantheon. Inshushinak still stood at Susa. Naparisha still reigned in Anshan. And when Elamite kings inscribed their names, they invoked these gods first. And even now, though their temples lie in ruin and their worshippers have long since passed into dust, their names remain. Carved in stone, pressed in clay, whispered in ancient lines, guardians of a people whose memory they still hold. Faith in Elam was not shouted from mountaintops. It was lived softly, patiently, and always near. In every Elamite city, from the heights of Anshan to the courts of Susa, the sacred moved alongside the ordinary. It was found in the preparation of incense, the shaping of offerings, the chants whispered before dawn. There were no sharp divisions between the sacred and the everyday. The divine breathed in the same air, touched the same ground. Temples stood at the center of Elamite life. They were not always grand, but they were deliberate, square halls of mud brick, open courtyards framed by columns, sanctuaries dimly lit where statues of the gods rested in stillness. These statues were not symbols, they were believed to carry presence. Their eyes, carved with care, did not simply gaze, they watched. Priests moved through these spaces with measured steps. Their role was not to command the gods, but to tend to them. They fed the statues, anointed them with oil, clothed them in fine cloth, and offered bowls of grain, honey, water, or wine. These acts were not theatrical. They were familial. The gods were honored like elders, with care, with constancy, with reverence. Rituals followed the rhythms of time, new moons, planting seasons, births, deaths, and coronations. In times of war, offerings were made to Inshushinak and Humban. In times of drought, prayers rose to Naparisha and Kiririsha. Processions wound through the streets, songs lifted over rooftops. The whole city, for a moment, became sacred. The ziggurat at Choga stood not merely as a monument, but as a ladder, a sacred ascent. Only the highest priests, and perhaps the king himself, would climb its upper levels, bearing offerings for the unseen God above. At its summit, the world narrowed into stillness, sky, prayer, and breath. Death, too, was touched by faith. Tombs bore inscriptions invoking divine protection. Burials were made with care, often near temple precincts. Some believed the soul would pass to a realm watched over by in Shushanag, a land of judgment, yet not of torment. The journey of the dead was one of return, guided by the divine toward balance. Elamite worship was never about grandeur. It was about constancy, about living in rhythm with the sacred, about remembering that the gods were not beyond reach, they were present, quiet, waiting. And perhaps that is why, even now, their names remain. Not because they ruled from thunderous heights, but because they dwelled in the silence where memory endures. In Elam, kings were not merely rulers. They were bridges between the sacred and the worldly, between earth and sky. Their power did not rise from conquest alone, nor from inheritance by blood. It came, most of all, from the gods. A king in Elam was chosen, protected, and judged by divine will. Without the favor of Inshushinak or Naparisha, no crown could hold. The titles they bore reflected this union. King of Anshan and Susa was more than geography, it was a statement of balance, of harmony between highland and plain, between the divine centers of the realm. These kings stood not only at the head of armies and courts, but before the altars of the gods. They were priests as well as sovereigns. In temple inscriptions, kings did not speak of their might. They spoke of their offerings. They built sanctuaries. They raised statues. They poured libations and remembered the names of the divine. Their words were filled with humility. I, servant of Inshushinak, I who built this in honor of the gods, I who placed this stone that my name may be remembered. Power in Elam was never absolute. It was granted and could be withdrawn. Kings were often judged by their deeds before the divine, whether they kept the temples fed, the people in peace, the rituals unbroken. Misfortune was not seen as weakness of rule, but loss of divine favor. There were dynasties, to be sure, families whose names passed from father to son, from brother to brother. But even these were marked by the sacred. A king's legitimacy was sealed not in lineage alone, but in ceremony. In coronation rites, priests invoked the gods, and the people gathered to witness the bond, a king not born, but made. The king was also a guardian of law, though Elamite law, unlike that of Babylon, was not carved in great codices. It was lived, spoken, handed down, remembered through generations. The king upheld order, mediated disputes, and ensured justice under the watching gaze of the gods. In moments of triumph, kings left steely, tall stones etched with their names, their victories, their gifts to the divine. But even here, the message was not pride, but piety. I conquered, they wrote, because the gods were with me. Thus Elamite kingship was a sacred duty, quiet, deliberate, and always aware of its place in a wider order. Not rulers by right, but stewards by grace. The kings of Elam did not build to astonish. Their palaces did not rise in polished marble, nor did they stretch toward the heavens in towering defiance. They were made of clay, of earth pressed and shaped, of mud brick cured by sun. And yet, within those walls, power lived. In Susa, the ancient capital of the plain, and in Anshan, the citadel of the highlands, the royal compounds were not symbols of extravagance, but of order. They reflected the rhythm of Elamite kingship, quiet, sacred, enduring. A palace in Elam was many things. It was a place of governance, where scribes recorded the will of the king and envoys passed through shaded courtyards. It was a place of worship, where offerings to the gods were prepared. And often, it was a place of burial, where kings and queens rested in tombs of their own making, their presence meant to endure beyond breath. The most complete example lies in the city once called Durantash, known now as Chogazanbil. There, within concentric walls, 3 palaces stood close to the great ziggurat. Their walls were thick, their halls long and cool, designed not to impress from afar, but to serve as dwelling, as resting place, as sacred ground. Here, kings lived near the gods. Here, death and divinity shared space. The architecture was deliberate. Outer walls enclosed the city. Inner walls protected the sacred. At the very heart, near the temples, stood the royal structures, a reminder that the king's authority was not his alone, but granted by the divine. Within these spaces, rooms opened onto courtyards where light pooled gently. Pilasters lined the walls, not decorative, but firm and silent, holding the structure with dignity. In some palaces, burial chambers lay beneath, as if the ruler wished to remain within the city's heart even in death. Nothing in Elamite royal design sought grandeur for its own sake. There were no wide boulevards, no halls of spectacle. Yet the feeling was one of presence, grounded, solemn, whole. Even in Susa, where the Elamites built and rebuilt over centuries, the traces of palaces remain, not as monuments, but as layers. As if each king laid his memory gently upon the last. Later, Persian kings would build atop those very foundations. Their palaces would rise in stone, adorned with lions and columns. But the earth beneath, the shape, the soul, had been laid by Elam. And so the palaces of Elam endure, not in splendor, but in silence. Built not to impress the eye, but to steady the world. Long after a kingdom falls, it is not the names of kings that remain. It is what hands have shaped, in quiet rooms, in temple corners, at the edges of a kill or an anvil. Elam left behind no towering statues of conquest, no endless walls of epic wars. Instead, it gave the world works of quiet precision, of thoughtfulness, of care. Its art was personal, shaped not to dominate, but to endure. Among the finest expressions of Elamite craft are its sculptures, especially those of bronze. The most famous is the statue of Queen Naparesu, cast with such weight that she could never be moved. Her folded hands, her smooth garments, the stern curse carved upon her skirt, all speak of both artistry and presence. She was shaped not just in likeness, but in spirit. Elsewhere, stone statues emerged from temple precincts, votive offerings, guardian figures, seated dignitaries. Their forms were often restrained. The lines were clean, the postures formal, the expression solemn. These were not images to provoke awe. They were to invite reverence. Reliefs carved into limestone and baked clay told stories not of chaos, but of offering, of divine scenes, of kings before gods. They were framed with care, their figures arranged with balance, their gestures deliberate. In some, the god's tower above the king, extending favor; in others, symbols, stars, horns, or serpents frame the composition in sacred rhythm. Seals, small yet profound, offer another glimpse into the Elamite soul. Cylindrical and carved with intricate designs, they were pressed into wet clay to mark ownership, approve transactions, or bless containers. They show animals, divine symbols, sometimes even myths now lost to us. In their tiny space, entire worlds were etched. Elamite metalwork revealed a similar subtlety, vessels of copper and silver, tools and weapons both functional and adorned. Nothing was wasted. Every object, even the humblest, was given shape with intention. The palette of Elam was earthy, the red of clay, the pale tone of limestone, the dark gleam of bronze. Its artisans worked not to dazzle, but to last. And so they did. These works, buried and broken, continue to rise from the ground. Not in splendor, but in whisper. Each piece, a bowl, a statue, a seal, is a voice from a time that spoke through silence, a reminder that beauty does not always shout. It endures. Elam was not built on a single tongue. From its first cities to its final twilight, the land was shaped by many voices, layered like the hills, echoing like the wind across riverbanks. Its people spoke in rhythms that were their own, but they also listened. They borrowed. They adapted. And through it all, they never forgot the sound of their own names. The Elamite language is like the land itself, ancient, persistent, and still partly mysterious. It is not connected to the Semitic languages of Akkad, nor to the Indo-European speech of later Persians. It stands alone, a linguistic island in the great sea of tongues. Its earliest traces appear on clay tablets from Susa, in the Proto-Elamite script. These markings, still undeciphered, suggest an early attempt to capture not just numbers and goods, but thought. Later came Linear Elamite, a more refined system, also enigmatic. Both hint at a civilization determined to define itself in writing, in symbols no one else used. But over time, Elam grew closer to Mesopotamia. Its scribes adopted Akkadian cuneiform, modifying it to fit Elamite speech. This allowed Elam to speak in the shared language of diplomacy, yet still carry its own voice within the form of foreign signs. Elamite evolved over centuries. Scholars now divide it into Old, Middle, and Neo-Elamite phases, each marked by shifts in grammar and style, each reflecting the changing shape of the kingdom around it. And though it was never the dominant language of the region, it was always present, steady, stubborn, enduring. Under Persian rule, the Elamite language found a strange afterlife. Though no longer spoken widely, it became one of the official languages of the Achaemenid Empire. Royal decrees, carved into stone on mountainsides and palaces, were written in Elamite alongside Old Persian and Babylonian. Elam's voice was used to carry the will of new kings. This choice was no accident. It spoke of continuity, of deep memory. The Persians knew that Elam had come before them, had shaped the land, named the cities, built the temples. By writing in Elamite, they honored that shadow. They claimed its strength. And though Elamite would eventually fall silent, its words remain on stone, fixed, unmoving, yet still speaking. In every character pressed by a stylus, there is a breath of the people who lived beside the Karen, who prayed in Susa, who carved gods into clay. They spoke a language the world has not forgotten, though it no longer hears it spoken. In silence, it remains. Elam did not rise from conquest. It rose from the land, from the slow breath of rivers, from the stillness of mountains, from the soft fold between high and low. To the east and north, the Zagros Mountains stood in solemn silence. Bridges rolled like waves turned to stone. They offered more than shelter. They shaped identity. In these uplands, Elamite life was old, close to the sky, close to the earth. The highland city of Anshan rested there, guarded by wind and rock, rooted deep in the hills. To the west and south, the world opened, wide plains, gentle slopes, and the winding waters of the Karen River. Here stood Susa, not in grandeur, but in grace. It lay low, but not weak, a city of clay and worship, of trade and writing, where the land gave freely and the people listened. Elam was never one thing. It was this contrast, either mountain and the valley, the ascent and the repose. Its kings ruled not from a single center, but from a balance between heights and hollows. They bore the title King of Anshan and Susa, not to boast, but to reflect this dual belonging. The mountains gave ore, stone, and wood, the breath of the wild. The plains gave grain, herds, and access to the broader world, the breath of life. Between the two ran roads of stone and memory, walked by herders, pilgrims, merchants, and kings. But the land could divide as easily as it could unite. In times of strength, the mountain and plain moved as one. In times of weakness, they pulled apart. And in this rhythm, Elam rose and receded. Yet it never vanished. The rivers always returned. The mountains never moved. Geography did not merely surround Elam. It cradled it. It formed its heart. And even now, if one walks the line where the Zagros sinks gently into the lowlands, they can feel it still, the quiet presence of a land that once gave shape to a people who listened to its silence and called it home. Elam never stood alone. Though it grew in the shelter of mountains and along the slow rivers of the plain, its eyes looked outward. Paths extended from its cities like branches from an old tree, toward Mesopotamia, toward the Persian highlands, and even farther still, to the distant civilizations whose names were once only whispers on the wind. Trade was Elam's first language with the world. From Susa, caravans moved westward, crossing the Tigris, entering the cities of Ur, Lagash, and Babylon. Elamite traders carried goods of their land, wool, wood, bitumen, and fine ceramics, and returned with tin, lapis, silver, and tales of temples that climbed the sky. To the east, the routes bent toward the highlands and beyond, to what would one day be called Iran, and farther still to the valleys of the Indus. There, across arid lands and salt deserts, lay Meluhar, known today as part of ancient Harappa. From there came beads of carnelian, seals with animals unknown in Elam, and a script no Elamite could read, yet treasured all the same. Southward, through passes and coastal paths, trade may have reached toward the Gulf, where boats stitched the coasts of Arabia, Bahrain, and Oman. Some brought copper, others brought stories. And always, Mesopotamia, the close neighbor, the eternal companion and rival. From the earliest times, Elam and Sumer walked parallel roads, trading, watching, sometimes warring. Sumerian spoke of Elam as a distant land of rich forests and fierce people. Elamites, in turn, took from Sumer the craft of writing, the form of seals, the discipline of record. Yet Elam never copied blindly. What it took, it transformed. Foreign goods became Elamite gifts. Imported forms were carved with native symbols. Trade was not surrender. It was exchange of goods, yes, but also of identity. And so Elam grew, not only by conquest or kingship, but through movement, the slow, steady rhythm of trade that carried not only wares, but culture, memory, and meaning. Even now, in the layers of clay at Susa or in the broken seals of far-off tombs, we find traces of that journey, an Indus bead beside an Elamite pot, a Mesopotamian jar in an ancient grave. Proof that Elam listened and answered. Across the slow waters of the Tigris, Elam faced a world that was both familiar and foreign. Mesopotamia, the land between rivers, stood as Elam's eternal neighbor. It was close enough to shape, distant enough to resist. And over the centuries, the two danced a long and complicated rhythm of war and peace, of imitation and defiance, of shadow and reflection. In the beginning, Elam looked westward and saw greatness. The cities of Uruk, Lagash, and later Babylon rose with temples that climbed toward the stars and kings who spoke with the voice of gods. Mesopotamia had writing before Elam did. It had ziggurats first. It carved law into stone. But Elam watched and learned. From Sumer, Elam took the form of cuneiform, then shaped it into its own tongue. From Akkad, it adopted the form of kingship, then gave it a local name. From Babylon, it took gods in captivity, not to erase, but to house in its own temples. The wars between Elam and Mesopotamia were many. Akkadian kings marched east. Elamite kings marched west. Susa was captured, and then recaptured. Statues were stolen, then enshrined. Each side saw in the other a threat, and yet also a model. There were years when Elam stood tall, its kings carrying spoils from Babylonian cities back to Susa. There were years when Elam was humbled, its temples emptied by Assyrian swords. But neither side ever truly erased the other. And deeper than conflict ran connection. Trade moved freely, even when armies did not. Language blended along the borders. Art shifted subtly, Elamite seals sometimes bearing Mesopotamian gods, Mesopotamian tablets naming Elamite kings. The two were not twins, but they were bound. If Mesopotamia was the voice of the plain, broad, loud, and inscribed in law, then Elam was the breath of the hills, quieter but no less enduring. Together they formed a dialogue that spanned millennia. And in the end, when both had passed into history, it became clear their stories were not separate. They were one. Far beyond the mountains and rivers of Elam, beyond the deserts and dry plains, there lay another world, green, ordered, and silent. A world of cities whose names are long forgotten, but whose presence once touched Elamite soil. This was the Indus Valley. Though no treaty binds them in record, and no war is carved in stone between them, the peoples of Elam and the Indus met, through trade, through gesture, through gifts carried on the backs of animals and in the holds of boats. In the layers of ancient Susa, buried beneath centuries of brick and dust, archaeologists have found etched carnelian beads, smooth and red, marked with delicate white lines, the work of Indus artisans. Alongside them lay seals, carved in steatite, bearing animals and signs not known to Elamite eyes. These were not local treasures. They had come from far. The journey was long, from the river cities of the Indus, through the arid lands of what is now Balochistan, across the mountain passes or by sea along the edge of the Gulf. Yet they came, and Elam received them not as strangers, but as honored offerings. There are no written records of these exchanges in the Elamite language, but the artifacts speak clearly. They tell of contact, peaceful, practical, purposeful. The people of the Indus were not only traders. They were builders, scribes, farmers, and thinkers. Their seals suggest a system of symbols, perhaps a form of writing. Though we cannot read their words, we can see their touch, and that touch reached Elam. What did Elam give in return? Perhaps wool, bitumen, fine pottery, or wood from the highlands. Perhaps ideas. Perhaps silence. But in the flow of goods, culture also moves, slowly, invisibly, shaping hands, patterns, and belief. These exchanges faded with time. The Indus cities declined. The road shifted. The waters changed. But the beads remained. In a quiet room in a distant museum, a carnelian bead still glows red in the light. It was once shaped by a hand beside the Ravi River. It was once worn, perhaps, by a woman in Susa. And in that moment, that meeting, two civilizations touched and remembered each other. Elam was a land of earth, of rivers, mountains, and fertile plains. But it was never far from the sea. To the south, beyond the curve of the hills and the long arc of the desert, the Persian Gulf opened, a narrow band of shifting waters, connecting Elam not only to nearby shores, but to distant lands whose names drifted through time like the salt wind. The Gulf was not a barrier. It was a road. Boats, carved from wood and caulked with bitumen, crossed its waters. Some came from Elam's edge, perhaps from ports along the Susiana lowlands or further east, where Elamite influence brushed the coastline. Others came from the islands of Dilmun, modern-day Bahrain, from Magan, possibly Oman, and even from the southern shores of the Arabian Peninsula. These were not ships of war, but of trade. They carried copper, incense, timber, stone, and rare shells. In return, Elam sent pottery, textiles, bitumen, and goods drawn from its highlands, perhaps even lapis or silver, filtered through Mesopotamia. This was a trade of rhythms, not constant, not vast, but enduring. Caravans moved inland from the ports, carrying the sea's offerings northward to Susa and beyond. Meanwhile, merchants may have offered prayers to gods of both land and water, to Inshushinak for protection, or to the deities of far ports whose names are now lost. Though the cities along Elam's southern edge are only faintly known, the presence of foreign goods within Elam's heartland, and of Elamite pottery and seals found far to the south, tells a quiet story that Elam knew the sea, and the sea knew Elam. In the Gulf, as in the mountains and the plains, Elam moved with care, not to conquer, but to connect. Even the language of diplomacy, carved in clay, bears signs of these maritime ties. References to Dilmun and Magan appear in Mesopotamian texts alongside Elam. These were names Elamite rulers would have known, even if their own voices remained silent on the matter. And though no harbor has been found intact, the waves still whisper. The boats are gone. The ports are buried. But the wind that once filled their sails still sweeps across the gulf. And in the dust of a coastal ruin, a fragment of Elamite clay still waits to be heard. Elam did not wear its kingship like a crown of iron. It wore it like a cloak of woven threads, some new, some old, some frayed by time, but all joined by the land itself. The first names came softly. In the shadow of early Susa, among the dust of clay tablets, a list of kings appears, rulers of the Awan dynasty. Their faces are gone, their voices silent, but their names remain. Awan itself was likely a city of the highlands, now lost, yet once proud enough to lend its name to kings. One of them stood apart, Inshushinak. He ruled not as a servant of others, but as a king of Elam. He left inscriptions in Elamite, built temples, and for a brief moment made Susa a city ruled not by Akkad, but by its own people. When he passed, the light dimmed, but the memory remained. After Awan came the mountain lords, the kings of Shimashki. Their power flowed from the rugged uplands, a league of families more than a single house. They were warriors and builders. They joined with others to bring down the third dynasty of Ur, and for a time, their names rang across Mesopotamia. But like the mountains they came from, their rule was hard to pin down. It shifted. It moved. It faded. Then came the Sukalma, the regents. This house did not speak of kingship as dominion. Their title, Sukalma, meant Grand Regent, not ruler above all, but steward, elder, guide. It was a family of brothers and sons, each holding part of the land, one in Anshan, another in Susa, a third perhaps watching the borders. It was not unity by command, but by kinship. These rulers endured. For centuries, they kept Elam whole not through conquest, but through balance. They sent daughters into foreign courts. They built temples. They shared power. And through this, they kept the land breathing. So the lineages of Elam passed, not like empires, but like rivers through the soil. They changed course. They split. But they continued. No single house ruled forever. Yet each left something behind, a name in stone, a temple rebuilt, a god remembered. Elam's legacy was not carved in triumph. It was carried through houses that listened to the land and ruled not to shine, but to endure. There came a time when Elam no longer moved as one. The title King of Anshan and Susa was still spoken, still carved into tablets, still worn by some, but the weight it once carried had grown light. The golden thread of unity, stretched too thin, began to fray. This was not a sudden fall, but a slow unfolding. As centuries passed, power began to drift away from the old centers, toward smaller cities, local governors, mountain lords, and temple families. The kings still ruled, but many ruled in part, in pieces. Authority became scattered like seeds across the hills. Some held Susa. Others rose in Anshan. Still others appeared in lesser towns whose names have since been lost to stone and silence. They called themselves kings. But they ruled without the old reach, their voices loud in the valley, but faint beyond the pass. And yet, Elam did not disappear. These were not years of chaos, but of change. The sacred rites continued. The temple stood. Offerings were made. Inshushinak still received prayers in his shrine. But no single hand held the land. Elam had become many Elams, each tied to its own soil, its own people, its own breath of memory. From this patchwork came brief moments of strength. A local prince might seize a city. A highland chief might rebuild a shrine. A daughter might marry into foreign power and draw alliance. But the days of a united voice, of a single house guiding both plain and mountain, had slipped behind the hills. This fragmentation also made Elam vulnerable. As Assyria grew bold and Babylon regained breath, Elam, divided, could not hold back the tide. Each part could resist, none could withstand alone. Still, there is dignity in the fragments. For even when the crown was scattered, the land endured. The people endured. The gods were not forgotten. The language still echoed in temple chants and the hands of scribes. And in each small court, each city that called itself royal, there was the memory of what Elam had once been. A whisper, not a command, but a whisper that still remembered. It did not fall in a moment. Elam, so long enduring, so often overlooked, met its end as a candle meets the wind, not by choice, but by pressure too great to resist. The world had changed. To the west, Babylon had shifted. To the north, Assyria had grown hard and relentless. And Elam, fractured and weary, could no longer shield itself behind its hills or its memory. In the 7th century before our era, the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal came. He came not as a rival, but as a storm. Susa, ancient heart of Elam, opened its gates to fire. The temples were pulled down stone by stone. Statues of gods were broken, their faces shattered, their names erased. Palaces were looted. Graves of kings were torn open. Ashurbanipal left behind no mercy, only a proclamation that Elam was finished. And for a while, it was. The land fell quiet. The cities crumbled. The rite stopped, Where once kings had walked in prayer and scribes pressed tablets with care, now there was only dust. But even in ruin, Elam did not vanish entirely. The people remained, in villages, in the hills, in the places untouched by fire. They kept the names of old gods in whispers. They remembered the sacred places, even if they dared not speak of them aloud. Elam no longer ruled, but it lived, quietly, beneath the notice of kings. Its language would still be used by scribes in faraway empires. Its gods would still appear in the corners of temples now ruled by others. Its cities would be built upon, layer after layer, until the name Elam became a memory buried under centuries. The fall of Elam was not the end of a people. It was the end of a kingdom and the beginning of a shadow. One that would linger. Not in the voices of conquerors, but in the silence that follows. Elam had fallen. Its cities were broken, its rulers gone, its temples hushed. Yet the land itself remained, and the memory, like coals beneath ash, still burned. Into this space stepped a new power. The Achaemenid Persians, rising from the highlands once ruled by Elamite kings, built an empire vast and ordered. And though they carried a new voice, they did not forget what had come before. In the soil of their palaces, they found the bones of Elam. And rather than cast them aside, they built upon them. The great palace at Susa, commissioned by Darius the Great, was not raised on untouched land. It stood atop centuries of Elamite brick. And in its construction, in the layout of its courts, in the flow of its processional paths, there were whispers of Elamite design. Not copied, but remembered. In the grand inscriptions carved by Persian kings, 3 languages appeared: Old Persian, Akkadian, and Elamite. The last was no longer spoken in the markets or the fields, yet it lived still, carried by scribes, used in royal decrees. It became a language of state, of ceremony, of legacy. Elam's gods, too, were not erased. Though the Persians worshipped Ahura Mazda, traces of older deities remained, in Shushanak's name still inscribed on foundation tablets, Naparisha still remembered in quiet ways by those who had kept the old faith. The Achaemenids did not revive Elam, but they honored it. Their respect was not loud. It was gentle, like a hand laid on old stone. In their world of new laws and wider lands, Elam was not a rival, but a foundation. Even the title King of Anshan, once borne by Elamite rulers, appeared again, this time claimed by Cyrus the Great, the founder of the Persian realm. It was not just a place. It was a name that carried weight. So Elam lived on, not as a kingdom, but as memory made useful, sacred, and still. It had passed from power into presence. And in the Achaemenid age, that presence shaped an empire. For centuries, Elam lay hidden. Its cities were buried beneath dust, its names forgotten by kings, its gods lost to time. No great historian preserved its story. No epic poem carried its fame. Elam faded, not in memory, but in mystery. Then came the shovel. In the 19th and 20th centuries, explorers, archaeologists, and scholars turned their eyes east of Mesopotamia. And in the plains of Khuzestan, in the ruins of Susa, Choga Zanbil, and the highlands beyond, they found it, piece by piece, word by word, breath by buried breath. They uncovered bricks stamped with ancient inscriptions, statues of forgotten queens, seals carved with Elamite signs, and tablets in a script not yet fully understood. They found temples laid out in careful design, tombs cut into palace floors, and ziggurats rising beneath centuries of earth. At Chogazanbil, they unearthed the great step tower built by Untashnaparisha, still crowned with sacred silence. At Susa, they found the statue of Queen Naparesu, cast in bronze and heavy with presents, her voice still carved on her skirt. And among these, they found words, thousands of them. Tablets in Elamite, in Akkadian, and in Linear Elamite, some readable, others silent still. They spoke of offerings, of kingship, of trade, of ritual. They told the story Elam had never stopped telling. Through archaeology, Elam rose again, not to rule, but to be known. Yet the work is not done. Much of Elam remains buried, waiting. Its language is still only partly understood. Its names shift and change as new tablets are found. Its story is still growing, still being traced in the dust. But what we know now is this: Elam was never lost. It was waiting. And for those who listen, through brick, tablet, and time, it speaks still. Not all history is written in stone. Some of it lives in the spaces between, in the notes of a flute, in the rhythm of footsteps across a courtyard, in the hum of voices at dusk. In ancient Elam, life moved not only in the halls of kings or the shadows of temples, but in homes, in fields, in streets. And though little survives of these quieter places, the traces are there enough to imagine the world that breathed beneath the official record. We do not have Elamite musical notation, but we have instruments. Clay rattles, small lyres, and flutes carved from reed have been found in the ruins of Elamite cities. Their forms match those of neighboring lands, Sumer, Akkad, later Persia, and they suggest a sound both local and shared. Music would have played softly in domestic life, in ceremonies, in lullabies, in seasonal rites. It may have accompanied offerings at temples or echoed in the courtyard during harvest festivals. The beat of a drum, the drone of strings, the chant of priests, these sounds once moved through the air of Susa and Anshan. And there were other sounds, too. The murmur of weaving, the pounding of grain, the hiss of oil in clay pots, the shuffle of sandals on brick floors, the clatter of seals pressed into wet clay, the laughter of children, the low chants of women gathered for ritual. Elamite daily life was not grand, it was steady. People rose with the sun. They tilled the land, cared for animals, fetched water from rivers. They cooked, traded, prayed, mourned, and married. In towns, scribes recorded goods and offerings. In temples, rituals marked the passing of seasons. In homes, ancestors were remembered, and gods honored with small gestures, a bowl of water, a whisper of thanks. These lives left behind few words. They were not the kings who built ziggurats or carved victories into stone. But they were Elam, the breath of the land, the hands that shaped its days. And though their music no longer plays, its echo remains. In the curves of their pottery, in the layout of their homes, in the sacred silence of places once filled with life. Elam had fallen, but it had not disappeared. Its cities, its gods, its people, they did not vanish with the sound of conquest. They remained, quiet beneath the surface, like rivers beneath stone. When the Persians rose, first under Cyrus, then under Darius, they did not build upon empty land. They built upon memory. And Elam, though no longer a kingdom, became part of the foundation. The language endured first. In the royal courts of the Achaemenids, Elamite was used alongside Old Persian and Babylonian. It became one of the languages of empire, written on tablets, carved into stone. In the archives of Persepolis, thousands of records speak in Elamite. These were not the words of kings alone, but of merchants, builders, priests, and scribes. Elamite was no longer the voice of sovereignty, but it was still the voice of order. Architecture, too, remembered. The palaces at Susa and Persepolis carried echoes of Elamite design, in the shape of rooms, the rhythm of space, the way light entered a court. They were grander now, stone instead of clay. But the hands that built them had not forgotten the old patterns. Even ritual survived. In the records of offerings, oil, wine, grain, incense, names from Elam's old pantheon appear. Humban, a god of the highlands. Naparisha, the Great One. These names were now joined to others, folded into new ceremonies. But they were not erased. And the title of Anshan, once worn by Elamite kings, returned. Cyrus used it, not as a relic, but as a link to land, to lineage, to something deeper than conquest. This was not revival. It was inheritance. The Persians did not claim Elam as their own, but they carried it in their words, in their buildings, in their silence. It became part of who they were, without needing to be named. Elam was no longer a kingdom, but it was still a presence. When a kingdom falls, it does not vanish. Its walls may crumble. Its kings may be forgotten. But its name, if it is spoken even once, lives on. So it was with Elam. Long after its temples were silenced and its palaces turned to dust, the name remained. Carried by others. Whispers in the histories of strangers. A shadow passed from hand to hand. In the records of Greek historians, the name appears, reshaped by distance, but still present. Strabo, Herodotus, others, they wrote of peoples in the East, lands of old power, strange tongues, and ancient gods. Some called it Susiana, after its great city. Some echoed the older word, Elam. Even in the Hebrew Bible, the name lingers. Elam is listed among the nations. Its people are remembered as archers. Its place is fixed not by power, but by presence. As if even to those far from its borders, Elam had left a mark. For the Persians, too, the memory did not fade. They continued to build in the land that had once been Elam's. They prayed in places where Elamite gods had been worshipped. And they honored the silence, even if they did not always name its source. In time, new kingdoms rose. Parthians, Sasanians, Arabs, Turks, Mongols, all came through the land where Elam had lived. And though they brought change, the earth remembered. Beneath every stone wall, every village path, lay the dust of Elam. Modern names still carry echoes. The province of Khuzestan, where Susa once stood, takes its name from the ancient Huz or Huz, an echo of the Elamite people, Hal-Tamti in their own tongue. Not quite the same, but close enough to feel the thread. So Elam did not end. It became something else. A name in a book. A layer in the earth. A sound half remembered. But still there. Still waiting. For a long time, Elam lay hidden. Its cities were not lost, only covered. Time does not erase so easily. It simply waits. And so, beneath the sun-baked mounds of Susa, beneath the grasses that swayed gently across forgotten walls, Elam slept. Until the 19th century, when men with maps and shovels came searching for stories buried in the earth. The first of these was Jacques de Morgan, a Frenchman who believed that the land could speak. In the late 1800s, he turned the soil of Susa, and what he found was astonishing: tablets, statues, temple bricks still marked with ancient names. One of these, heavy and silent, bore the figure of Queen Naparesu. Another held the laws of Hammurabi, brought there in war. Each find was a breath of Elam returned. Over time, others followed, careful, curious, patient. They brushed away the centuries. They recorded walls, catalogued shards, pieced together broken seals. They walked the ruins of Chogha-Zanbil, where a great ziggurat still stood in silence, built not for show, but for prayer. At places like Half-Teep, they found tombs of kings once buried in reverence, and the tablets that recorded their gifts. At Ram Hormuz, a farmer digging his field uncovered a 4,500-year-old Elamite tablet, not a treasure of gold, but of language. These were not grand discoveries. They were quiet. A word here. A seal there. But piece by piece, the shape of Elam began to return. And even now, the work continues. In museums, scholars read tablets by lamplight. In deserts, archaeologists mark the sand. In hills once thought empty, the land still speaks, slowly but clearly. Elam has not finished telling its story. It was never gone. Only waiting. Elam once spoke. It spoke not only in stone and offering, not only in the rustle of silk or the call of the river. It spoke in a language, unique, distant, and still not fully known. The Elamite tongue is unlike any other. It belongs to no family, no tree of languages we know. It stands alone, like a mountain with no range behind it, a language isolated, but not silent. The oldest signs come from the early 3rd millennium before our era. In cities like Susa, scribes used a system we call Proto-Elamite. Its marks are many, its tablets found in the hundreds, records, ledgers, traces of order. But its meaning is still hidden. We can see the hands that shaped it, but not the thoughts behind the signs. Later came something new, linear Elamite. Its symbols were simpler, more direct. They appeared on vessels, in temples, on monuments. For centuries, their meaning was locked away. But now, slowly, they begin to speak again. Recent work, quiet, careful, and deep, has begun to decipher these signs. Scholars like François Desset believe they have found the key. The script, they say, is phonetic, it records sound, not just meaning. And the sounds are Elamite. This changes everything. For if linear Elamite truly speaks, then we are hearing not only the voice of kings, but of a people. A language that once moved through markets, prayers, and songs. Later, Elamite shifted again, this time written in cuneiform, the wedge-shaped marks borrowed from Mesopotamia. It became a language of law, of record, of empire. The Persians used it. Thousands of tablets speak in Elamite from the halls of Persepolis. Still, much remains unknown. We do not know what Elamite sounded like. We do not know all its grammar. And we do not yet know how it began, or why it stood alone. But we know this, it mattered. It was carved in stone, pressed into clay, written in ritual. And that tells us that Elam spoke with care, and listened, too. Elam did not measure time by the ticking of gears. It moved with the land, through the rising of rivers, the shift of wind, the cycle of sun and seed. Its calendar was not written in numbers, but in gesture, in ritual, in offering, in the soft return of things once given. In spring, when the fields turned green and the air began to warm, the people of Elam brought first fruits to the temples. They did not come in crowds. They came as families, bringing grain, oil, wine, or milk. These were placed on small altars, often outside, beneath the sky. It was a quiet thanks, not for wealth, but for life. The gods most honored were those of earth and growth. Naparisha, the great god of the highlands, and Kirarisha, the mother of all things rooted. To them, the people gave the season's first gifts. In summer, when the heat pressed down on the land, rituals turned inward. Temples became cool shelters for offerings. Water was poured. Fires were kept low. Priests whispered prayers in ancient words, not loud, not grand, but steady. It was a time of waiting, of trusting the soil. In autumn, the harvest came. This was the season of fullness. Simple festivals were held, not with splendor, but with warmth. Songs were sung. Clay lamps were lit. Animals were offered, but always with care. Food was shared in courtyards, and the gods were thanked once more. And in winter, the world rested. The fields were still. The people gathered indoors. Small rites were held, prayers for the sun's return, for the sleeping seeds. The temples were quieter now. But the gods were still present. Always present. Throughout the year, the rhythm of ritual was woven into daily life. There was no division between sacred and ordinary. A meal, a birth, a planting, all could be blessed. All could become prayer. Elam's time was circular. It returned. And with each return, it remembered. Not in festivals of noise, but in the gentle balance between sky and soil. In Elam, art was not a roar. It was a whisper. It was not made to conquer the eye, but to honor the unseen, the gods, the ancestors, the silence between prayers. Within the courts of Elam, art grew not from power alone, but from care. Queens, priests, and kings alike gave shape to beauty, not as display, but as offering. One figure still stands, still, after thousands of years. She is Naparesu, a queen, cast in bronze so heavy she could not be moved. Her form is still. Her hands are folded. Her gaze does not boast. And on her body, words are carved, not to celebrate, but to protect. It is a statue not of pride, but of presence. This is how Elam created. Sculptors shaped gods with gentle faces, kings with quiet posture, and animals at rest. The lines were simple, the gestures modest. There was no need for spectacle. The work spoke for itself, with balance, with care. Temples, too, were shaped with this same thought. The great ziggurat at Choga-Zanbil, built by Untashnaparisha, was not made to rise above all others, but to gather them, a sanctuary for many gods, a space for sacred calm. Its bricks were placed not just with skill, but with reverence. Even small things, seal impressions, jewelry, ceramic vessels, carried the mark of patience. These were not made for markets. They were made for meaning. The patrons of this art did not sign their names in stone. They left no paintings of glory. But their legacy remains in every curve of carved stone, in every pattern pressed into clay. Their art was not about being remembered. It was about remembering. Elam is no longer a name on the tongues of nations. It is not carved into modern stones. It is not raised in anthem or flag. But it is not gone. It lives in the dust, in the deep foundations of cities still standing. It lingers in the soil of Khuzestan, in the buried bricks of Susa, in the broken ziggurat of Choga-Zanbil, where the wind still moves gently between ancient walls. Its voice is soft now. Not lost, only quiet. The Elamites built their world slowly, patiently. They did not shout their greatness. They sang it in clay, in bronze, in ritual. They did not leave epics. They left prayers. They did not seek eternity. They sought meaning. And because of that, they endure. Not in glory, but in memory. Elam is a reminder that history is not made only by those who conquer, but also by those who listen, who build, who remember. That the soul of a people can survive not in the power they wield, but in the care they take, with their land, their gods, their time. Now, when we speak of Elam, we speak for them. We are their voice. Not to shout, but to whisper what was. Elam's story ends not with a fall, but with a fading. No one moment closed its gates. No single voice declared it gone. It drifted into silence, slow as the settling of dust, gentle as dusk. And in that silence, it waited. The palaces crumbled. The gods were no longer named. The language grew quiet, then still. And the world moved on, forgetting what it had once known. But memory is not always lost. Sometimes it lies beneath the earth, waiting for a hand to uncover it, for an eye to recognize, for a heart to listen. Elam remained in the soil of Khuzestan, in the buried bricks of Susa, in the heavy bronze of a queen who would not be moved. It lived in the shape of temples, in the curve of seals, in the quiet strength of a language that refused to vanish. And when the silence was finally broken by shovels, by scholars, by the turning of old tablets, Elam spoke again. Not loudly, not in triumph, but in truth. Its story is not of empire alone. It is of people, of a land shaped by care, by ritual, by time. A people who did not leave great battles or loud songs, but who built with patience, who worshipped with reverence, who endured. And so Elam reminds us that history is fragile. That memory must be carried. That silence is not always the end. It is often a beginning, waiting to be heard.